Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. 2 years since the Gaza war began, sparked by Hamas's October 7th terrorist attack against Israel, the conflict finally looks like it could come to an end. Both the Israeli government and Hamas said they accept in principle the White House's recently proposed 20-point plan to stop the war and work towards an enduring peace. But of course, the devil will be in the details. How are the negotiations over the specifics going, and what are the remaining sticking points? What are the competing visions for a lasting peace, and how can the United States and regional partners contribute to bringing one about? To discuss all of these issues and more, we're joined today by our new colleague, Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen. Lucy is a senior fellow with the Middle East Institute. She joined MEI after 15 years at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she directed its work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Lucy, welcome to Middle East Focus. It's great to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me on.
So can you start by laying out kind of in broad brushstrokes what the Trump plan actually involves?
Yeah, so in broad terms of what's already a fairly broadly framed plan, I mean, really more of a proposal or a framework, you have 20 points of the plan. And I think I'll break it into a couple of categories. I think looking first at what is hoped by those looking for success here will happen immediately is that we'd be looking at a release of all the hostages, the remaining hostages from Gaza, that's the living hostages, and the remains of those who are deceased. That would be accompanied by an end to the war, an end to the fighting, and then a release of Palestinian prisoners. I think it's around 200 prisoners is what's stated who are serving life sentences in Israeli prisons, in addition to about 1,700 Gazans who've been detained by Israel since October 7th, since Hamas's October 7th attack. That would then be envisioned to set in motion a transitional phase, transitional governance and security apparatus. And with that, what is envisioned is Hamas disarmament, a transitional and apolitical sort of technocratic Palestinian force sort of running the day-to-day administrative, but overseen by an international board, a board of peace, which is an international governance board, of which it was announced at the press conference at which Trump announced this, that he would be heading that board. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the UK, and someone who's been long time involved in efforts to mediate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more broadly, would also be on that board, and envisioned are other senior global leaders not mentioned. And that board would oversee this transitional phase. There would also be, with disarmament of Hamas, an international stabilization force. Again, non-specified specific countries, but looking at Arab and other international actors. Then in coordination and consultation with the IDF, with Israeli forces, determine when there is readiness for Israeli full withdrawal or withdrawal to a anticipated buffer zone. So those are broad contours there of the plan. Included are other pieces here which are more forward-looking, but also with sort of some undetermined timeframes. So one of the pieces of focus, something that is in there, is that Hamas actors who would give up their arms and commit to peaceful coexistence with Israel would get amnesty, or for those who wanted to leave, safe passage to and harbor in third countries. There is also this mention of a role potentially going forward at an undetermined time for the Palestinian Authority, but after reform. And again, when it talks about benchmarks in this plan, it doesn't give timeframes. It will talk about the fact that there will be efforts overseen by this international transitional force to benchmark and determine whether reform has happened enough that maybe at some point the PA could be in a role to take over on a pathway towards what could amount to a Palestinian state at some point.
So we are recording on Tuesday, October 7th, and as of Monday, the Israeli and Hamas negotiators have been meeting in Egypt to negotiate the technical details of the plan and its implementation. So we're going to get to the talks themselves in a moment, but before we do, how has the U.S. plan been received on both sides?
Well, you saw the U.S. plan was announced. President Trump announced it standing side by side with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. And, that plan was put out certainly after consultations with the Israelis. So they're in a different position when you look at the two sides. In this negotiation, the Israelis were consulted, certainly, in the development of this plan, alongside other actors, whom we can talk about that later in the conversation. The plan was announced as already having the buy-in of Netanyahu, though it was notable that even during the press conference, when accepting the plan and thanking President Trump for it, he did make a point of saying that he did not agree that there should be a Palestinian state. Again, something that is nodded to, albeit with a very hedged timeline and prospect in the plan. But again, you had this, so let's call it a qualified yes from Netanyahu. In the immediate aftermath, you had Hamas in the very immediate aftermath saying they hadn't yet seen it, but they would look forward to reading and considering it. And then you got a qualified yes from them as well, which is what led to these talks that are now underway in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, with the Americans there present and with Qatar and Egypt, sort of, again, all serving a mediation role in these indirect talks. So as far as we know, we have qualified yeses, but with a lot of the details to be worked out.
Could you actually speak a bit more about the timing around the Trump administration's plan? What prompted its release, and what simultaneous factors were conducive to bringing both sides back to the table, as well as garnering regional support?
Yeah, so we'll sort of start large and zoom in. I think what prompted this release is that as we approach this, and now today as we record, we're at the 2-year mark. After 2 years of this just brutal, punishing, devastating, all the adjectives that you can think of here that don't even begin to capture it, this war of 2 years grinding on, I think that we got to a point where the president had enough and wanted to start seeing some movement forward. Now, impetus for this came, interestingly, I would say, when early in September, Israel, we may recall that the Americans had put out a ceasefire proposal. And while Hamas was considering that proposal, Israel attempted an assassination attack on the Hamas negotiators in Qatar. This caused quite a crisis in Gulf-U.S. relations almost, and certainly brought together the Gulf actors in a way that we haven't seen, and other Arab actors in a way that we haven't seen before. Israel's attack was not successful in taking the lives of the Hamas negotiators they were focused on, but what I think it did do is really put in stark relief, certainly for President Trump, the fact that you had this deep concern now by Arab actors and key Gulf allies of the United States, deep concerns as to whether the U.S. could be seen as a credible partner. And also probably with that, called into question not just the prospects that Trump has been focused on of expanding eventually the Abraham Accords, but even the sustainability of those Abraham Accord agreements that already exist, which were really a first-term signature Trump achievement. And so I think that a lot of these factors really lit a fire in terms of it's really time to get things done. We need to move towards de-escalation in a serious way and stabilization, as opposed to what was happening, which seemed like further spiraling and de-escalation. Now, you asked the role of the regional actors. This comes after the regional actors and also the European actors had been moving themselves for quite a number of months. We may recall going back to early in the calendar year when Trump first put out his idea of what might need to happen in Gaza. He shocked many at his suggestion that this Gaza Riviera plan, where there would be mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, that itself lit a fire under the Arab acts at the time. In March, we saw really as a direct response to that, an Egyptian plan put out that was later adopted by the Arab League and then later OIC countries, saying here's an alternative to that. There obviously can't be displacement, so this is what we believe should happen. And you see elements of that plan in the 20-point plan. Following on from there, you saw an effort by the French and the Saudis in July. They brought together a conference focused on the two-state solution and getting there via an end to the war and day after vision in Gaza. And again, you see elements of that as well in the 20-point plan. So you really had a convergence here of mobilization, galvanization of other actors, probably honestly in response at first to feeling that the US wasn't playing the role it needed to. And so them stepping in to try to fill that void. And then finally, we've seen, interestingly, in the last few days, Trump coming in and playing what has been the more traditional role of the US when there has been active mediation, which is a coordinating role of all these actors.
You touched on it briefly just now, but I wanted to drill down in a little bit more detail on some of the previous proposals, specifically the Egyptian-Arab proposal and then the Saudi-French one. What do you see as the sort of through lines and key differences between those and the current Trump proposal?
Right. Well, the through lines obviously start with a ceasefire and then this notion of there has to be stabilization, a transitional force, transitional governance, transitional security. Flooding in, I didn't mention before, and a key one, of course, is now flooding in humanitarian aid. I mean, the 20-point plan actually said, to minimally the levels that it was during the January ceasefire. Of course, it needs to be sort of at scale, no holds barred. But these are through lines. There is a through line of a longer-term political vision, but that's where you really begin to see some differences. The Franco-Saudi plan, what was called the New York Declaration, is insistent, and also the original Egyptian and then became the Arab League adopted plan of March, are very, very definitive on a two-state solution. I think the New York Declaration, it says it almost in every point. It keeps reminding the reader that two-state solution is the goal and the necessary goal to end this war and ensure a sustainable peace and a sustainable solution. And it's also in that New York Declaration and the Arab plan that preceded it, there is also a definitive mention of the PA eventually. I mean, it talks about PA reform. That's another through line, this assumption that the PA is in no way ready to just jump in and take over immediately. They all talk about reform, but it is very clear and definitive that that's where the vision is in these. In the 20-point plan, not so clear and definitive. And I think what you're seeing there is an attempt to get to this qualified yes we talked about, right? Israel, Netanyahu's been very clear that he doesn't see a role for the PA from the very beginning. He's had a sort of no Hamas, no Abbas, and this has been part of the challenge. Then what are we looking at? Trying to get to any kind of day after vision or end of war vision even had been quite impossible. So the departure of ways is on the definitive nature of a role for the PA, and also on the definitive nature, frankly, of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. The 20-point plan does not mention two-state solution. Again, it has this hedge, if the Palestinians meet a certain reform barrier, we may see our way to having a direction towards, obviously not verbatim, but it is that qualified. And I think, the other interesting language we see, which is a through line with Trump's first term in office, is actually there's an interesting phrase in there when it gets to the hedge language on potential Palestinian statehood. It says something like, which we recognize as a Palestinian aspiration. I've sort of dwelt on that phrase a lot because it really is distinct from what we saw happen at the UN just a few weeks ago when you had a recognition by actors, many US allies, European actors, of a Palestinian state. Again, this was a very highly symbolic, it didn't change anything on the ground, but effectively that recognition was derived from this notion that the Palestinians have a right to a state. This is sort of a rights-based recognition, and the details will have to be figured out. I don't think it's accidental that this was phrased as which we recognize the Palestinians have an aspiration towards. It somehow holds the notion that that's qualified. It won't necessarily mean that they'll get there. And I was put in mind of, during his first term, Jason Greenblatt, who was his envoy on the peace process, was once talking about, I think it was sort of the Palestinian goal that in the two-state framework, their capital would be in East Jerusalem. And he said, in talking about international law, he was saying, international law, it's very, I don't know if he used the term ambiguous, but it's inconclusive. There's many ways to read it. And it's really, it's not a legal right. They have an aspiration. to that. So again, I think there's a consistency here we see with very much this hedging around that issue.
Just wanted to follow up specifically on that language about the, quote, credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood in the Trump plan. What do you think that tells us about the Trump administration's policy vis-a-vis a two-state solution?
I think it tells us what we've known, which is the Trump administration is not really willing to put a definitive marker down on what the end goal vision is. This is close. And I think cutting against that, it was notable. Again, I'm going to take us back to Trump's first term. We may remember very early on when he was doing this issue in his first term, there was what became quite, famous, such as it is, then term at the time that I've looked at one state, I've looked at two states, I like the one that the parties like best. It was something along those lines. I believe it was with the first White House meeting with Netanyahu during that term. And so that sent, analysts and watchers and regional actors, that was the first time it sent people being like, yikes, are we throwing up for the first time what had been an American policy position of two states? And this ambiguity persisted until, interestingly, Trump eventually put down in 2020 his Peace to Prosperity plan, which certainly by no means met anybody's definition of what a two-state paradigm that had been seen to be the international consensus was about. But ultimately, at the end of the day, was framed as a two-state solution, which to my mind tells you that try as you might, everybody seems to circle back to this as maybe as the best of all other bad possibilities, but it does seem to be something that the Trump administration circled back to then as needing to at least be nodded to. And now I think we are back there again. Now, where the American administration, where the president is himself on this, is unclear. He doesn't tend to be particularly ideological around any of these things. As we know, he's transactional. And so I do see this 20-point plan as a way to get, the hedging was a way to maybe get the Israelis on board, who've been very clear they don't want it. But he couldn't, and particularly going back to what I mentioned before, what galvanized in recent weeks the Arab states in particular. The Arab states have been clearer than they could possibly be, that there is no way around for them this idea of a pathway to a Palestinian state. And there's no way around it if Trump wants to see the furtherance of his regional integration goals, expansion of the Abraham Accords, and particularly with that sort of holy grail of Israeli-Saudi normalization. The Saudis have been consistently clear. And they themselves are the ones that first came up with this term that itself was maybe a little bit qualified of a credible pathway towards. That was already a bit of an out, right? That we don't need you to announce one tomorrow, but we need to know that you're serious about a political horizon. So we keep seeing that hedging getting sort of more and more hedged. But I think that's what we're seeing. It's that language has to be in there. It has to be nodded to get the buy-in of the regional actors, and getting even beyond just the ceasefire hostage release we're talking about. If we are thinking, Trump mentioned many times at that press conference, he's tweeted many times since, the idea that this isn't just about a ceasefire. We're moving towards permanent peace, eternal peace, solving this conflict that nobody's been able to solve. There is not going to be any way to move forward in that regard without having that as a North Star.
I want to turn now to the Israel-Hamas indirect talks being held in Egypt. What do we know about where those stand? What's on the table for discussion? And what are the main sticking points as you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't know much about exactly where they stand, but we can imagine and have a sense as well from things that have sort of been said going into this, what the sticking points would be. One primary one will be this question of Hamas disarmament. This is a sine qua non for Israel. And also it has been for the Arab states. We saw that reflected in the New York Declaration. And, this is something that the U.S. and its allies is very clear on, and Hamas is clearly wanting to be seeking either more clarity on or some wiggle room on. And so the question, I think, will be, this was one of those interesting points as well, where when Hamas first gave its qualified yes answer, Netanyahu was quite dismissive of it, and many in his coalition noting that, is Hamas even going to, disarm? They mentioned they'll release the hostages, and there was a pretty quick, as we understand it, almost like smackdown from Trump of like, we got a yes, Like, let's take the yes right now and let's work with it from there. So we have to imagine that is being heavily discussed, what that will look like, because again, in the plan, it doesn't give a timeline. It doesn't really give a process for what that looks like. So that will be one piece. Going back before that, the hostage release, which is the first thing that is supposed to happen, that is going to be logistically incredibly complicated. I imagine the hostages, as far as we know, are not all in one place. They're not necessarily all being held even by Hamas, the same faction. Do they know if they know where all the living hostages are? Do they know where all the remains are that are supposed to be released? So there's a lot of just pure logistical decisions and discussions to be had. And of course, that release would also have to go along with, Israel's withdrawal lines to allow those releases to happen. So there's those very technical and, of course, very meaningful points. And I would imagine as well that one of the challenges here is the Hamas negotiators who are sitting around the table represent the political leadership who are based generally in Qatar. They are negotiating on behalf of actions that are going to have to be taken by Hamas militant actors on the ground, those who have the ability to scuttle this or move this forward. And I don't think it's entirely clear right now, particularly after 2 years of war in which Israel has done a significant amount of damage to Hamas leadership, command and control. What does that look like in terms of these negotiators' ability to actually speak for, on behalf of, and hold accountable those on the ground who are going to have to carry this out, let alone the command and control that those actors on the ground in Gaza have over ensuring that other factions aren't going to scuttle this?
Yeah, we're actually seeing in a separate theater in Lebanon what the disarmament process for Hezbollah is looking like. I'm not saying that there are necessarily direct lessons here for the Gaza-Hamas situation, but or if you could get into a bit, some of the scenarios that we may be looking at. How likely is this to be the factor to scuttle the entire process? How do you move past that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and any number of things can go wrong. Obviously, I mean, certainly when you have 20 steps, I look at that. That's 20 stumbling blocks, of which at each one there's a point at which things could fall apart. And even just looking at the first few steps, if we're even just looking right now at the sort of hostage release, prisoner exchange, aid coming in, so many things that could go wrong, so many opportunities given how non-specific some of these terms are, some of these principles are, so many excuses each side would have to say the other side is not adhering to what the spirit is, or the letter is of some cases. So this is something to watch, even if there is a welcome announcement in the next couple of days that yes, we have movement, we're moving ahead. I think everybody will be and needs to be holding their breath. Most of all, of course, the hostage families, the people on the ground in Gaza who have just been going through this for way too long. I was thinking, actually, as I was thinking about the scuttling scenarios and where this could fall apart. And this also relates to this idea of, even if you move forward in the plan, the indeterminate nature of who decides whether Hamas has stopped posing the threat it needs to in order to move to the next stage. I was put in mind of going back to the early 2000s, the Second Intifada. You might recall that there was this, in order to try to get to talks, the Prime Minister of Israel at that time, Ariel Sharon, had said, we need 7 days of quiet, and then we can sort of talk about, moving forward on peace talks. And of course, 7 days of quiet never came, because the idea that there would be the discipline in place, that there would be not one attack, one violent attack that would happen, and being able to pinpoint whether that was really authorized by your negotiating partner as opposed to a renegade actor, etc. There's too much wide open space here. And so this is where the third party actors will come in, the US, Qatar and Egypt, where they are going to have to play a role here in corralling the parties on which they have the most leverage.
You spoke about the PA earlier, the Palestinian Authority. For it to be able to take on any sort of realistic role in helping govern or administer the Gaza Strip, what do you see as the biggest issue it has to overcome? Is it a political legitimacy problem, or is it a structural reforms problem? And what should the international community or the regional supporters of the PA focus on to help it
Yes, to your first question, it is both. There is a political legitimacy issue. There has been for a long time, predating October 7th, and the star certainly hasn't risen amongst Palestinians since then. They've been seen at best as ineffective, sort of missing even from the scene. And this wasn't helped. I mean, the striking visual to me during UNGA recently, right? The US did not grant visas to the Palestinian delegation. And you just had, this very striking visual there of what we're looking at here. You had Netanyahu giving his speech, and, the striking visual there is everybody leaving the room when he got out, which was sort of a reminder of the ongoing international isolation for Israel. But then also the isolation of Mahmoud Abbas, just sort of zooming in or beaming in, however it was, whatever platform, to the UN to give his speech, because he wasn't allowed in by the US. Just sort of put a sort of heavy underline on the fact that he's really not been a significant player in this. And of course they weren't consulted and hasn't been part of the development of the 20-point plan, certainly. And so there's the credibility and legitimacy issue, and there is the reform, which has been, efforts over many, many years to enforce that and impose that, or help, depending, cajoling, sticks, carrots, etc. Probably not enough on the part of the international community on that type of reform. And so these all, and training as well, training of, if the idea is that it's be Palestinian security forces that will be taking over security eventually, there would be a lot more capacity building needed. There were great strides made on that over many years, but there'd be certainly a lot more needed to take on this task. The one thing I'd say in reform that isn't, I think, getting a lot of play right now, actually, Abbas said it in his beamed-in speech at the UN, and he said it a few times. There's been this issue for quite some time now of the prisoner payments, as the Palestinians referred to them as, or the martyr payments, as they referred to them as, the pay to slay, as it came to be kind of coined here, which was where Congress, accused Abbas over many years in the PLO of sort of giving stipends to prisoners and families of prisoners who were accused of committing terror attacks on Israelis. There's been a lot of pressure for many years, and particularly brought to a fore because of something called the Taylor Force Act here, which was legislation stopping money going, assistance going to the PA in any form until they stopped this payment system. Over many years, starting with the Biden administration, there were efforts to reform that. And recently, Abbas announced, and he announced again during his UN speech, we have converted this system. It is now a social security system. We urge, it is ready for audit. This reform has taken place. We urge the State Department to come verify it, which they would need to do in order to start on the path to reversing or getting rid of Taylor Force. There's been no answer on that. The US has not responded on that. And so, the PA has shown signs, and I think this is also with probably some cajoling as well from partners in the Arab world, that the PA is trying to put its best foot forward to say we're serious about it this time. It's got a credibility gap there too that it needs to overcome. But this is why, under any circumstance, put aside how hedged the 20-point plan is, you did see this timeline envisioned even in the Saudi Franco plan and the Arab plan before that, assuming there would be this runway of capacity building and reform needed in order for the PA to be ready for sort of prime time there.
Giving it all the history you just laid out here, do you actually think it's a worthwhile effort to be doing this at all? I mean, is the international community fooling itself a little bit and trying to think that it can bring the PA up to the level it needs to be?
Yeah. I mean, it may be, but I think the answer is that the international community sees no alternative, right? Whereas Netanyahu had no Hamas, no Abbas. I think the international community says, okay, but then what? What is the alternative?
And what does all this mean for the Israeli military campaign in Gaza?
Well, according to Trump's announcement and multiple times since pronouncements in recent days, it actually should have meant already a stopping to the military action in Gaza. That has not been the case. Maybe it's diminished slightly. I'm actually not even sure of that, but it certainly has not stopped fully. But if we see over the next couple of days yes, we're moving forward with this, it means for now the military campaign has stopped. Again, we go back to this idea of at what point might Israel be able to point to a look and say the conditions aren't being adhered to on the other side. It's time to resume. But they would be under a lot of pressure, I'd imagine, if we get to this first stage, certainly from President Trump, to not do that unless, again, Trump decided there was a clear abrogation by Hamas of what was agreed to.
Given everything that you've spelled out, do you think the Trump plan provides enough of a framework for a more detailed, workable plan? And what kind of international support, political, economic, diplomatic, would be needed to make that work?
Yeah, look, I think it provides a starting point and a framework. I mean, it's the first thing we have seen from this administration that approaches some indication of what a forward-looking policy is on this. Again, incredibly broad and a lot to be filled in. And I should note as well, and I was actually remiss in not mentioning this before when you asked where do these plans diverge, a huge area, I mean, it's wrapped up in this notion of a definitive two-state horizon, is where the West Bank plays into this. The West Bank is mentioned nowhere in the 20-point plan. That is not the case in the New York Declaration, because, of course, if you're looking at a credible two-state horizon, you're looking at an integrated Gaza West Bank integrated unit, which, of course, also has implications for what we've just been discussing, sort of the PA role. The idea would be eventually a reformed PA would be in charge of a Gaza and West Bank as two units comprising a Palestinian state. So that is one of the big glaring holes that will need to be addressed. It is interesting. It didn't make it into the plan, but a few days before, Trump had put that bright red line on no annexation in the West Bank, which is something the Israeli government had been threatening in the wake of the state recognitions at the UN. Trump said absolutely no, he wasn't going to allow that, and that also came with some, of course, the Arab states, particularly the Emirates, who were the original ones that sort of got them to the Abraham Accords by stopping annexation the first time around in the Trump term, recently put down a red line on that as well. So that is going to have to be one of the big pieces that's missing, that would need to be in the mix if we even get to that point of longer term talks. What it would take, just briefly, if we are sort of off to the races on being able to get that far, is concerted, coordinated effort and staying power by President Trump, right? Here we have a president who may be close to having announced a deal and may get this first part through. Does he have the staying power and patience to keep up the pressure on the parties and to play this continuing coordination role? I did note that it seemed very uncharacteristic to me, at least of his foreign policy to date, when he launched this plan at this press conference. He kept referencing the role that the Arab allies have played, the Europeans have played. It's very out of character. If you think about it, he's really been someone who's pushed a very unilateral America go it alone policy. This was really something that harkened back to what analysts of sort of so-called peace process over many years would say what is needed. Coordinated, concerted engagement, multilateral engagement. You think back to the old sort of quartet idea days that emerged during the Bush administration. And so that's what it would take. The regional actors and the European actors, particularly if you look at the New York Declaration, that's fairly detailed. That's a lot more detailed than 20-point plan. So there's some detail there to work with to fill in the gaps, but it won't be doable unless President Trump keeps his eye and focus on the ball here and his determination to see this through.
Longer term, what do you think success looks like for the Trump administration on this? Do you think they have the sticking power to keep doing what you've just described?
I don't know. If he determines he is, they're going to my eye, need to staff up very differently. Right now, I mean, it's perhaps laudable they've got to this point in recent days of putting this plan out and getting the parties to the table. But you have an envoy in Steve Witkoff who's focusing on this and many other conflicts. This can't be done with the amount of detail that will be needed to fill in the gaps to ensure this works without heavy staffing up. Interagency, as much as there's maybe an allergy to that with this administration, that will be needed in order to carry this forward. The president announced that he would be the head of this Gaza Peace Board. That's a very in the weeds. If this Gaza Peace Board is going to do what it needs to do, that is a very in the weeds job for someone who's the president of the United States and has all the domestic and international agenda to deal with that he does. And so it remains to be seen whether he sticks through it or whether it will be enough for him to get the ceasefire, the hostages out, announce victory, announce peace, and move on. That may be more likely at this point, but we'll see.
Oh, we've covered a lot of topics today, a lot of different sub-issues here. What is your assessment and what are your takeaways of the Trump plan, but more generally the diplomatic process that is going on right now?
It's a start, and I say that not as flippantly as maybe that means. I mean, I think at the end, to go back again, you can't belabor the point enough. After this brutal 2 years, any chance of stopping this war and opening an aperture to move into something more positive is welcome. But there is a high likelihood, without sticking at it, that the parties are going to revert to old habits. I think that there was this, hope's the wrong word here, but a notion maybe in some minds that, gosh, October 7th and everything that happened afterwards was so unprecedented in its scope and scale and so sort of generationally sort of shifting in terms of, the impact it's going to have, that surely this had to kind of blow something open and put the parties in a different course. And I think, unfortunately, you've not necessarily seen that. You've actually seen the parties increasingly resorting to some of the same habits. And I think about the fact that, when there have been rounds of fighting with Israel and Gaza before, a lot of times ceasefires would be achieved and basically you just go back to the status quo ante. There was no forward movement. The ceasefire was achieved and everything would be quiet for a while, but you're really back where you were. This 20-point plan has all the elements of risking that happening, right? If you have that, so you'll sort of have this oversight of an international board and transitional international body that you didn't have before. But if effectively what they're overseeing is aid coming in, but in consultation with Israel, sort of deciding when the time is right to withdraw fully or to hand over fully to Palestinian leadership, you're really not in a particularly different position than we've been in before. And so I worry about that. Again, I'll take the start if we can get there, and would really hope that there is enough momentum and enough desire, frankly, by President Trump to be able to do something historic here, potentially. Right? If he's got, I cannot think of a time in recent diplomatic history on this conflict when you have actually had the Europeans and the Arab actors and the US kind of aligned in such a way that if they sustain this energy, right, you could actually bring about something that is meaningful. But there's a lot between here and there to get to that point.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see how the future turns out. We'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much, Lucy, for joining us on the program today.
Thank you.
And warm thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in, as well as to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and efforts to bring it to an end, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.